The COVID-19 pandemic had a profoundly negative impact on Africa's sovereign debt situation. Currently, almost half of all countries on the continent are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. This means that African governments are struggling to pay the debts that they incurred on behalf of their states. This situation has further been exacerbated by the war between Russia and Ukraine, which is causing commodity prices, particularly food and crude oil products like petrol and diesel, to rise. It is also disrupting the supply chains of critical goods like fertilizers. The ability of countries to manage their debts is complicated by the changing composition of that debt. They now owe more money to a broader range of creditors. In 2020, Sub-Saharan Africa had a total external debt stock of $702.4 billion compared to $380.9 billion in 2012. The amount owed to official creditors, including multilateral lenders, governments, and government agencies, increased from around $119 billion to $258 billion. Joining me from the United Kingdom is Tim Jones, Head of Policy for Debt Justice UK. Tim, welcome to Business Edge. Thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning.
All right. So let's go straight into this, because when we have this conversation about African debt and the situation around that, transparency or lack of transparency continues to be one of the major issues. And when you look at the accumulation of this debt and the use of the debt over time, there's still a lack of transparency in that. So what are the implications of this lack of transparency on African economies and even their ability to repay debt and even to continue in terms of searching for economic prosperity?
Yes, so where debt is contracted transparently and where the media and public know about what's happening, it is more likely that debt will be spent well. It will be invested in more productive things, and that is crucial because if it's well invested, that then helps enable it both to be repaid, but also that the net benefit is much better. Also, if there's a transparent process, then governments can actually get lower interest rates. So if you're trying to go out and see who will lend to you and make it very transparent what you want to do, how you want to use the money, you've got more people that you can go and seek those loans from. It's more competitive, and so you get a lower interest rate.
So why is fixing this lack of transparency such a critical part of being able to fix Africa's debt problem?
It's a part of trying to prevent debt problems from happening. It's a part of enabling debt to be used well. For countries that have already got lots of high debts and high interest debts, it doesn't necessarily help right now. There's other things are needed as well to deal with that burden of debt that already exists. But in order to use loans well in the future and to prevent crises from happening in the future, transparency is.
Okay, so Tim, let's look at the prevailing narrative for many people, which is that China is the one that owns most of Africa's debt, or China is the country that's pulling African economies into a debt trap. In a report from Debt Justice, you find that that might not be the case. And we also spoke to the authors of that Boston University report into just exactly how much debt China owes. And it doesn't look like it's exactly what the narrative is. So Tim, explain this to us in terms of who Africa owes and really in terms of how much, what's the situation?
Yes, so about across African governments altogether, 12% of their external debt are owed to China. And 3 times more is owed to Western private lenders, to Western banks and companies. And then similar amounts are owed to multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. So China is an important creditor, 12% isn't nothing, but often the rhetoric is overblown about China's importance. It's a key creditor, but it's by no means the main one or the biggest. And all these creditors need to be investigated and addressed to deal with the debt problems that particular countries have.
So it's not just who we owe and how much, it's also the interest. So one of the things that reports from Debt Justice found is that the private lenders who we owe more to than China actually charge the highest interest rates of 5% compared to 2.7%, which is charged by the Chinese, and around 1.3% interest rate charged by multilateral lenders such as the IMF and the World Bank. So when you look at the fact that we owe them more, then we're also paying them more interest for the loans that we've taken from them. What does this really translate to for African economies and countries that are borrowing from these private lenders?
Yes, so too often when we talk about debt, we just look at the amount of debt owed and don't think about the interest. The key thing with debt is not how much is owed, but how much you have to pay every year and what that is as a proportion of your income. That's how debt matters to you as an individual, and that's how debt matters to governments. So the higher the interest rate, the more you're paying, and so private lenders charge the highest interest rate, so that means their share of the problem is even bigger. There's actually a particular issue with the world financial markets at the moment as well. The interest rates on loans from private lenders are going up quite dramatically over the course of this year. That means that for some governments to borrow from them will cost even more in the future. But actually, for many governments, they're no longer able to borrow new money from foreign private lenders. And that's crucial because they're expecting to be able to borrow that money to pay debts coming due. And that may not now be possible because the interest rates are just so high.
And that takes me to my next question. There have been a number of African countries flagged for being in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress. And a lot of people are worried about what it would take to push them over the edge. We don't have a timeline for when the Russia-Ukraine crisis will end, which will help to ease some of the global inflation we're seeing now. So that's something that we can't really look at in terms of how long it might have an impact. But when you look at these countries, we look at Kenya and Ethiopia, Nigeria is mentioned at being at high risk as well. What do you think it would take to push these countries over the edge into debt distress and into sort of the situation Zambia found itself in 2020?
Yes, so I think an important thing to start in answering that question is, what does debt distress mean? So that is, those 11 countries, that's decided by the International Monetary Fund, and what they mean by debt distress is not paying your debt. What we think is a bigger issue is paying the debt, but the cost of doing so being big cuts in public spending, in economic crisis. And so actually, there are many countries that are already over the edge, that are still paying their debt, but the cost of that on people is already very high. We estimate about there's 25 countries in Africa whose debt payments are so high, it's having a big impact on their ability to meet public services and basic needs. Actually, you mentioned Zambia. Zambia defaulted on their debts in 2020, but that actually is started as the route out of Zambia's debt crisis. Up until that point, there had been huge cuts in public spending in Zambia. This year, having defaulted, they're now expecting to increase public spending again. And ultimately, defaulting on debt and then trying to negotiate a reduction in the debt with your creditors is the way out of the crisis. So that's not so much going over the edge, it's actually recognizing the problem and starting to try to deal with it.
So, Tim, historically, we've seen that debt resolution in Africa is messy and protracted. It took over a decade for the heavily indebted poor countries initiative to be implemented, and there was also litigation with external creditors concerning the Republic of the Congo and Angola. And this disorderly resolution frequently leads to large and often permanent output losses. So when we're looking at Africa's debt problem, Tim, I think part of the conversation also has to be on who's coming to the table and what are they willing to give and to take when it comes to this debt conversation. We've seen African leaders in recent time talk a lot more about debt restructuring and even debt forgiveness as well. But are the lenders themselves coming to the table? So China is at the table right now with Zambia. Many of us are watching to see how that plays out and what other countries can benefit from. But they're not the only ones we should be worried about. Are the other private lenders charging sometimes 5% willing to sit down at the table?
The key thing that debtors do have is the ability to stop paying their creditors, and it's that ability that can bring those lenders to the table to negotiate. So debtors do have that agency and power. Now, there are many of us around the world that want to campaign in solidarity with people and governments that are pushing to get debts cancelled, because we need to recognise that when debts can't be paid, they shouldn't be paid. They should not be paid on the back of cutting health spending or cutting education spending. It would be much better if there was a comprehensive system for negotiating debts down to a sustainable level across all creditors. That doesn't yet exist. But within the system that does exist, it is possible to negotiate a cancellation of some of the debt. But governments need to be willing to say, either you cancel some of our debt or we're not going to pay you. And that's what private creditors will listen to, because it's the threat of not being paid that will bring them to the negotiating table.
All right, Tim, before I let you go, let me ask this. It seems African countries have found themselves in a catch-22. They need loans for infrastructure and developmental projects. They're already also in debt and struggling to pay the loans that they have. And getting loans is not just expensive because of the cost, but because of everything that comes with it. What options are there for African economies in this kind of the devil and the deep blue sea kind of situation?
From the point of view of somebody like me, I'm in the UK. I'm in a country that committed huge injustices of colonialism, of helped cause the climate crisis. We are campaigning to get reparations for colonialism, for climate change as a source of finance to rectify the systemic problems in the global economy that affect many African countries. From African government's points of view, there are other sources of money other than borrowing high interest loans from private lenders. They include tackling tax avoidance and evasion, tackling richer companies and people more, trying to stop capital flight where money rushes out of countries to tax havens around the world. There's lots of sources of finance there that could be used instead of trying to borrow high interest loans from private lenders, which actually isn't the source of money in the end for governments, because the high interest rates mean that they cost governments far more than they get from those loans.
All right, Tim Jones, thank you so much for joining me today on Business Edge. It's a conversation that will continue, I'm very sure, as well as the campaign that Debt Justice is doing in terms of African debt, and we'll be talking in the future.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And one of the things that he said that stuck with me is that when the debts can't be paid, it shouldn't be paid. At what cost will African nations and their citizens continue to pay for high loans? And of course, making sure that there's something those loans are actually getting about in the long run. You're watching Business Edge. International Business Headlines is up next, and then we continue our conversations. We're in Africa's largest economy as we look at the tax problem there. Compliance is low. Is there any way to encourage more Nigerians to pay their taxes? And then we talk South African tourism. Is the industry recovering? Stick around.